Hey guys, welcome back to HoloNet Marauders. AJ here with you again today. On a recent video covering the marketing around Attack of the Clones, we mentioned how LucasArts had a different approach leading into that film compared to the Phantom Menace. In this video, we're going to look a bit closer at that. Before we get to that fun though, be sure to like and subscribe for more Star Wars content. Now, this is where the fun begins.
What do you want?
So I want to compare the games that came out around both the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, and take a look at how each approach differed. Let's first take a look at the Phantom Menace and its tie-in games. All in all, the Phantom Menace had a whopping 9 games attached to it, by far the most of any Star Wars film. You had Episode 1 Racer, the Phantom Menace game, Jedi Power Battles, Obi-Wan Adventures, Battle for Naboo, Starfighter, Super Bombad Racing, Obi-Wan, and Racer Revenge, which is kinda sorta also an Attack of the Clones game, since it involves an older Anakin. 3.5 of those, the Phantom Menace game, Jedi Power Battles, Obi-Wan Adventures, and Obi-Wan, actually cover the events of the film, which is pretty nuts. So the strategy around these game releases seemed to focus on covering the story of the film, fun wacky racing games, and being a pilot in a sweet Naboo starfighter, checking all the boxes for what you need in Star Wars games, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s. We do have an interview on our channel where we interview the creators behind the Phantom Menace game, and while in touch with them, I asked why they think LucasArts decided to make 3 games focusing on the story of the film. While they could only speculate, they mentioned how it was the first time a new Star Wars film was being released in the 3D gaming era, so it only made sense to go all in on the games. And while it may seem redundant to make the same game 3 times, well, 3.5, each of those were sort of different. Power Battles was a more platform-based beat-em-up style of game, and Obi-Wan was just a revamped version of the Phantom Menace game, with it coming out 3 years later on Xbox. So, speaking of 3 years later, let's shift our focus to the gaming wave that came out with Attack of the Clones, and how LucasArts changed up their strategy and what they wanted. Episode 2 had 5 tie-in games compared to the 9 that the Phantom Menace had. And first up, we have Jedi Starfighter, which is a sequel to Starfighter with characters like Nim returning. Instead of playing as a Naboo pilot though, you're playing as Jedi Adi Gallia and her new prototype Jedi Starfighter. With the new film came the awesome Jedi Starfighter that Obi-Wan Kenobi zooms around in, so LucasArts definitely wanted a game with that in it. The first Starfighter game took place mostly during the plot of the Phantom Menace, while Jedi Starfighter is a bit of a bridge in between the films, with the ending taking place during the Battle of Geonosis. It gives a bit of background knowledge on the ongoings of the Trade Federation and the Separatists that we don't see in the film. We also get to see what sneaky things Count Dooku is up to. As cool as the Jedi Starfighter is, it's still 100 times more fun to play as Nim and his ship, just like in the first game. Overall, I just find that this game is a vast improvement on its predecessor in terms of both story and gameplay. I recommend Jedi Starfighter for those of you who haven't played it, even though it's pretty outdated at this point. Remember I mentioned the Phantom Menace having 3 games that followed the events of the film? Well, Attack of the Clones sorta had one, if you want to even count it. It was Attack of the Clones for Game Boy Advance, and it was, well, pretty bad. I'm sure some people had fond memories of this game. I certainly do enjoy a bad game from time to time. And no offense to handheld gamers, but I barely count this as a tie-in game since it didn't come out on consoles or PC. This game sorta reminds me of a worse version of the Super Star Wars games, with enemies and such who really made no sense. Even the Obi-Wan Adventures game made this game look really bad. All complaints aside though, it is kinda cool to see the game go from lightsaber combat to flying levels, back to lightsaber combat with different characters. So, I guess I'll say Attack of the Clones has half a game that follows the film story. Next up for our games is the Clone Wars, not to be confused with either of the animated series. This game is actually pretty good, and we even recently replayed it at HoloNet Marauders. It was a good time. Minus a few absurd boss battles, it holds up with the gameplay at least. Some of the story is a bit wild, with Anakin being captured by Dooku and threatening to kill him with an ancient Sith weapon called the Force Harvester, and that's just one weird piece of the story. It's also sort of not very Jedi to be driving around in a tank blowing things up, but hey, it's a very fun game. This game is sort of the opposite of Jedi Starfighter in the sense that it starts with the Battle of Geonosis and continues the story past the film into the Clone Wars that Yoda mentions at the end of the film. Pretty cool at the time to get a continuation of the film you just saw earlier that year. And that wasn't the only game to pick up where the film ended, as new Droid Army for Game Boy Advance, yes, another Game Boy game, came out and covered Anakin investigating a Separatist weapon on Tatooine of all places. There, he faces off with Aurra Sing and is captured by Jabba the Hutt. There's a plot to destroy the Jedi archives, and later on we see Anakin having to capture Wat Tambor, and oddly enough ends with Anakin killing Count Dooku? So, that makes no sense. As goofy as this game is, a lot of those details, minus the Dooku death, feel like actual arcs from the Clone Wars show. So maybe I'm bold to say that New Droid Army and some of these games were stepping stones for the greatness of the Clone Wars show. Anyways, moving on. Last, but certainly not least, we have Bounty Hunter. Possibly the best of the games on this list. In this one, you play as Jango Fett, 10 years prior to Attack of the Clones. Much like some of these other games, this one gives background, both equally cool and weird, to Jango Fett, Count Dooku, Darth Sidious, and more. The gameplay is an absolute blast, no pun intended, and there's some really cool features added in, like scanning for random bounties mid-mission to get credits. I've always loved that little detail. In this game, Palpatine wants Dooku to kill his Padawan, sounds familiar, who is a crime syndicate leader named Komari Vosa, as he senses her as a threat. Dooku reaches out to Jango Fett to do the job for 5 million Republic credits. Along the way, more background is given, like how Jango met Zam Wesell, how he found the Slave One, and how Jango was chosen to be the template of a clone army. All Legends lore at this point. It's a wild ride of a game that once again includes some crazy lore, but it's definitely another game I recommend from this lot that holds up fairly well. And there you have it, all the major games for the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. Of course, there's a few other games like real-time strategy games and kids games and others that I left off the list, as I mostly stuck to the big title main course games here. You can really tell that with the Attack of the Clones games, they went into heavy backstory and side lore, compared to the Phantom Menace games essentially being replays of the movie. Which of the games from these lists are your favorites? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, guys. Be sure to like and subscribe for more Star Wars content, and I'll see you on the HoloNet.